Welcome to another edition of RCE. Again, this is Brock Palen. You can find us online at rce-cast.com. And once again, I have Jeff Squyres from Cisco Systems and also one of the authors of OpenMPI. Jeff, thanks again for your time.
Hey, Brock. Here we are in December, the traditional downtime for HPC, since we're all recovering from Thanksgiving and supercomputing and whatnot.
Yeah, the follow-up to SC and all the holidays and family stuff starts coming in, and things just kind of slow down a lot.
Slow down. So, there may or may not be another RCE cast at the end of this month. We'll see. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, we'll see if we can squeeze in one more.
You started something new here in December, didn't you?
Yeah, actually, I started it at SC. Is something I said I was going to do, and I quickly just threw it up. But you'll find on the RCE website a link not only to Jeff's blog, but also Brock now has a blog.
And Brock talks about himself in the third person on this blog, too.
Yeah, okay.
All right, so let's just jump right into this then. Brock, I believe you've known our guest here for a couple of years now, right?
Yeah. So this podcast is more going to be a follow-up because a previous podcast we had, which was RCE 37 about TeraGrid. TeraGrid recently went away and is now followed on by something called XSEDE, and there's been some changes. So I have on someone I have worked with through TeraGrid and now XSEDE for a few years now. I have Phil Blood from the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center. So Phil, why don't you take a moment to introduce yourself?
Hi, Brock and Jeff. Thanks for having me on your program. I'm also have listened to your podcast and appreciate the work you're doing here. So I'm excited to be here. So so I work at the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center, and I have for the last coming up on 5 years now. My background is in biomolecular simulation. My Ph.D. was at the University of Utah with Greg Voth, who's now at the University of Chicago. So I looked at really large-scale biomolecular assemblies, membranes, and proteins and things, and basically was a user of these big national systems and enjoyed working in that realm so much, as much as I did working in the science area. So eventually, I joined up with the PSC, and now I work as a scientific consultant and researcher with different research groups across the country, trying to help them use the facilities at these national resources to the greatest extent possible to maximize the return on their time and investment and research. So I'm also have become part of, beyond PSC, also XSEDE, as Brock mentioned, and working in various areas there in outreach and education, and also in some training, and also through extended collaborative support with researchers in that from an XSEDE standpoint also. So that's a short intro to what I do.
So that's interesting that you were working on your PhD, was looking for resources, found these resources, and the organization never really lets you go. The interesting thing about that is that's kind of how I got started in this field too. I had an opportunity when I was in school, went into it, found I liked it, and never actually left. So
Same thing happened to me with MPI, actually.
Oh, really?
My first MPI forum meeting in '94, and wow, that was a long time ago.
So I remember my advisor asking me when I started, are you more interested in science or computation? And at that point, I said computation, and he happened to have a grid. He said, you ever heard of something called grid computing? And there was a project there to do some work in the group related to grid computing. It was sort of the idea of the folding at home and BOINC that we were looking at the time. But I got really excited about these things and knew I wanted, whatever I ended up doing in science, which I also found very interesting. I knew I wanted to do it through computing, and so that's what drew me into at the time it was TeraGrid, as you said, and I looked at that and said, wow, that looks really cool. And I never would have imagined at the time I would have ended up being actually working in being a part of TeraGrid, and then continuing on to the next generation of this national cyber infrastructure. So it's something I enjoy doing a lot.
So you used a key word there, cyber infrastructure. From a researcher's point of view, and from being a support person at a university that consumed TeraGrid resources, what exactly happened to TeraGrid? It seemed like it was infrastructure. Why did it go away?
Well, it all has to do with NSF funding cycles, and TeraGrid was funded in several cycles in the previous decade. I was just reviewing the history of that, and it started out as there was a solicitation for what the solicitation described as a distributed terascale facility, and initial award was made to San Diego and Chicago and Caltech, and I'm probably forgetting one, and NCSA to create this distributed terascale facility, and they called it TeraGrid. And so that's how TeraGrid was born, and then the funding for TeraGrid was extended into several TeraGrid Phase 2, and the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center actually joined at that point as a part of the extended terascale facility, what the solicitation called it, and they put down a big resource at that time. I think it was Lemieux, and that was, and then there was additional funding that funded TeraGrid through 2010 or so, and then the NSF put out another solicitation. They called this one XSEDE, which stood for Extreme Digital, was what they were looking for, and taking it to this next generation of what they call advanced digital resources, and sort of moving beyond just thinking of it as these big universities or big centers with big iron, into a more inclusive sort of digital solution for advancing science. And so that's why they called it Extreme Digital. And the winning proposal in response to that solicitation was called XSEDE, which stands for, if I can get this right, I'll be impressed, Extreme Science and Engineering Discovery Environment. So that's sort of how that evolved in a nutshell.
Okay, so what's different about XSEDE versus TeraGrid? So you talked a little bit about the evolution here, but concretely, what does that mean? What was different between these programs?
Well, so the first answer to that, I guess, is that we're trying to keep everything that was good about TeraGrid and leave it alone, or at least I guess the mantra is do no harm. So a lot of the things there are actually very similar. One of the best things that was the partners, a lot of the partners are similar, although there's been some shifting around. The resources right now, in terms of the main computational resources, are quite similar, but basically the same that we had as TeraGrid ended. So there's a lot of things that are similar, and we can talk more about some of the things that's similar and different. But that main difference, I think, that we're moving towards in XSEDE is making things more inclusive of all the different ways that people compute. So one way to illustrate that is in TeraGrid we had what we called resource providers, and the focus was on sort of the resource and what resource do you have to contribute. And that would basically be a machine, right? That they're contributing cycles, and of course there were people there contributing expertise too. But now in XSEDE we have the idea of a service provider, and the service provider may not even have a machine to contribute. If you look on the website, you can see the list of all the people who are service providers. And one of them is actually Jülich Supercomputing Center in Germany. And they're not certainly providing a machine to TeraGrid, but or to XSEDE, so you're going to catch me on that. But they are providing services, expertise that we are providing to users.
No, what does that mean? Does that mean I can call them up for help, or they help write code, or what does it mean to provide expertise?
So that's a good question. So you won't call them up or write to them directly necessarily.